This is a video about world building, but to explain it, first I have to explain a fair amount of science, so I hope you enjoy it. When I was in college, one semester I was taking the classes of modern physics, material science, renewable energies and circuits, and one day I saw the same topic in all of them: crystals. In the class of circuits, our professor explained how we could use crystals to create diodes and transistors. In the class of modern physics, our professor explained how Einstein discovered why some crystals generate electricity when they are exposed to light. In renewable energies, we saw how to use that discovery from Einstein, the photoelectric effect, to create solar panels. And finally, in material science, we saw why crystals arrange themselves in those shapes and why they have those properties. Suffice to say, I left campus that day thinking a lot about crystals. Specifically, I was thinking about the similarities between crystals and antimatter, because there is a process that happens in crystals that is very similar to a process that we know creates antimatter. It works like this. If you have a photon with very high energies, then it is possible that it will spontaneously transform into two particles, one of matter and one of antimatter. Usually this is an electron and an anti-electron. The anti-electron has the same properties as the electron, same mass, same spin, except it has the opposite electric charge. And so, since the electron and the anti-electron have opposite charges, they attract, and when they touch, they transform into light. Something very similar happens with crystals, although it's a little bit harder to explain. When atoms form crystals, they share some electrons. Specifically, they share those electrons that have the most energy. Those are the ones that are farthest away from the nucleus. These electrons are able to move freely through the crystal, and so we call them the conduction band, because this is what gives metals their property to conduct electricity. One important thing is that even though the electrons are moving freely, as soon as one electron leaves one atom, another one arrives, and so at any given point, all atoms in the crystal have the same amount of electrons. But here is where things get interesting, because all the electrons that are not being shared could move to the conduction band if they gained enough energy. And electrons gain energy by absorbing light. But here's the thing, depending on the atom they are in and the crystal they are forming, electrons can only absorb light with the right amount of energy. If it has too little or too much, they cannot absorb it. For simplicity, let's imagine that there is a crystal made of only 10 atoms, and each atom is sharing one electron with all the others, so there is a total of 10 shared electrons. Nice. Now, let's imagine that a photon with the right energy comes along, and one of the electrons that is not being shared absorbs it. So now it is able to move to the conduction band and move freely through the crystal. Well, now we have a problem. Let's imagine that this 11th electron moves from atom A to atom B. Well, what is going to happen is that atom B ends up with one extra electron. This means that it has extra negative charge. While atom A is lacking one electron, so it now has positive charge. The positive charge from atom A will attract some of the other freely moving electrons to come and fill that empty space. Let's say that it came from atom C. Well, now atom C is lacking one electron. So this is like trying to fill a hole by digging dirt from another hole. You are just moving the hole somewhere else, but you are not filling it. This is known as the photoelectric effect, and Albert Einstein won a Nobel Prize for figuring out what was going on. But check this out. The electron hole has electric charge, positive. It moves, so it has a speed, and it has a position as well. And moving it takes energy, so it looks like it has mass. It has all the properties a particle would have, even though it is not a particle. It's literally the absence of a particle. But that's not all. If the electron and the electron hole ever meet, then much like Goethe in the book A Wizard of Earthsea, it will fill the hole it had created, releasing the extra energy and returning balance to the crystal. This looks exactly like the photon transforming into matter and antimatter from before. Now, in the case of the crystal, we can see that this is clearly an illusion. a result of the properties of the real particles that form the crystal. We call these illusions emergent properties. For example, temperature is an emergent property that arises from the vibrations of atoms. Electric resistance is an emergent property that arises by how easily atoms can share electrons. The symmetry of snowflakes is an emergent property that arises from the properties of water molecules. But here's the thing. Here is the question that I left campus that day thinking about. If they were people living inside a crystal, how could they realize that the electron holes are an emergent property? What experiments could they do to figure out what the truth actually is? I've asked this exact question to many people over the years, and the first impulse many people have is to simply say, well, that's impossible. They deny the premise outright. They argue that it is an idea so absurd that it's not even worth considering. And if that's what you think, please don't subscribe and click the dislike button. But for the rest of you, this is where the world building finally begins. Welcome to my world. It is a world very much like ours. It has a sun, a planet, a moon. It even has people. And these people experience the same physical laws that we do. Their atoms are held together by the strong force. They are wistfully unaware of the wacky weak force. And everything around them is ruled by gravitational and electrical fields. But for whatever reason, there is one extra field, a crystal field. This field has the same electrical properties that the electric field from a crystal would have, except that, as far as anyone can see, there are no obvious sources. But it is there. To be more specific, I will say that the scale of this field is 1 millimeter. The scale of a crystal field is the separation between the atoms generating this field. Of course, a scale of 1 millimeter is way too large for any crystal made of atoms, but remember that the sources in this case are something else. Also, we need to choose what level of energy this field is going to be sensible to. That means what kind of light it's going to absorb. I don't want to deprive the people of this world from seeing any colors, and I don't want to mess with their vision, so let's put the sensitivity comfortably in the ultraviolet. That should be fine. For thousands of years, people would develop in this world pretty much as we did. They would be hunter-gatherers, they would develop agriculture, and little by little they would start developing science pretty much as we did. Until one day, someone realizes something. Light sources, specifically blue and violet ones, seem to electrically charge the air around them. This is because the field is absorbing some of that light and producing electron and electron holes. This would actually be similar to the real-world effect known as vacuum polarization, but I have no time to explain that if I want to make this video less than an hour long. As news of this discovery spread, people would probably think that it is a result of some kind of interaction between light and air, and so they could probably develop primitive vacuum tubes to test this, and they would realize that this effect is independent of air or any other medium. Since now they have vacuum tubes and electricity, they would soon discover cathodic rays, just like we did. Cathodic rays are just when you strip the electrons out of something. It looks really cool. And seeing that, they could probably make the connection that these negative particles coming out of metals are the same negative particles that are being created by light sources. And they would probably theorize that all matter around them is made of positive and negative particles. At this point, they could even discover X-rays and use them to see the structure of crystals. A discovery that will become very relevant, but they don't know that yet. All of this would probably give people the impression that light sources are somehow turning energy into matter, and they would probably theorize that the universe was created when a huge light source transformed a bunch of energy into matter. The problem is that they can see how the negative and positive particles created by light sources annihilate each other, and they have never seen them turn into atoms. They would probably see this as the biggest mystery of science, similar to our antimatter paradox. As chemists start studying chemical reactions, they become able to estimate the mass of individual atoms, and they are much heavier than expected. The mass of the positive and negative particles they know contributes almost nothing to the mass of the entire thing. So, where is the mass coming from? They would probably theorize the existence of a third kind of particle, one without electrical charge that contributes to the mass of the atom. So, in a way, they would be discovering the neutrons. They are right about some things, and yet they are so wrong about many others. But eventually, one scientist would come up with some equivalent of Rutherford's gold leaf experiment. In this experiment, you have some extremely thin gold leaves, and you shoot radiation at them. And by studying how the radiation bounces from the gold or goes through it, you could deduce the structure and mass of the atoms. The results would baffle them. Matter would be indeed made of positive and negative particles, but the positive particles inside of matter are much heavier than they ever expected. And the positive particles they have seen light creating for so long are nowhere to be seen. They don't form part of anything. Even worse, now that their equipment has become much better, they can realize that these positive particles are never created in scales smaller than 1 millimeter. They have finally discovered the crystal field. For decades, scientists are confused about the nature of the crystal field. Until one day, some scientists discovers that photons with very higher energy are capable of transforming into particles of matter and antimatter, like the electrons and electron holes they are so used to. But their interpretation of this discovery would be very different from ours. They would probably theorize that there is yet another crystal field that works in a much smaller scale and that is sensitive to much higher energies. They would probably start suspecting that there are many more crystal fields acting in different scales of space and energy. Thinking about all of this makes you wonder, how do we know that we are not living inside a crystal field? It makes you wonder if maybe some things that we think are fundamental are actually emergent properties of something else that is much more fundamental. That's the power of world building, to make us see our world in a new light by considering worlds that do not exist. And that's it for today. I hope that I left you thinking a lot of things. Please tell me some of the things you are thinking in the comments, and please subscribe and give a like, and stay tuned, because next week I'm going to share with you the mythology of the modern age, the mythology of the four gods.